Hello and welcome to the third installment of our new webinar series, British Houses and Heritage with Curt DiCamillo. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical organization in the country, and we specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise to uncover and share the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Today, we'll take a stroll through just a few of the beautiful gardens that dot the English countryside, hearing the stories behind their creation, their owners, and how they truly are perfection on earth. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. And I also want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from our homes with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. And even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website. So our tour guide and shepherd today is Curt DiCamillo, an internationally recognized authority on English country houses and the decorative arts. Curt joined American Ancestors in February of 2016 as our first curator of special collections. A longtime member of NEHGS, Curt has led highly successful heritage tours for our organization to England and Scotland and Italy. He has lectured extensively in the United States and abroad and taught classes on British culture and art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Curt was previously executive director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation USA, and as curator of special collections here at NEHGS, Curt provides strategic direction and expert guidance for organizing and exhibiting our extensive collection of family history-related artifacts. So please join me in welcoming Curt DiCamillo.
Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in this afternoon. I don't know what it's like where you are, but here in Boston, where I'm sitting, it was cloudy almost all day until about probably 20 minutes ago when the sun came out, which I think is obviously divine blessing on this lecture that we're going to participate in. For me, there is nothing, you've probably all heard me say this before, nothing more special than England. And as part of that, the house and its garden. And I have to stop right there and say, I am an architectural historian. I am not a horticulturist. So what you're going to hear are about gardens that are attached to country houses as part of a setting, overall setting. And just a few statistics, because this always blows my mind, and I think it really blows most Americans' minds. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the four constituent parts of the United Kingdom, all four of those put together are smaller than Oregon. And we know there are over 3,000 gardens just in England alone, just one of those four parts, that are open to the public on some basis. 3,000 in this teeny tiny country. There are more gardens open to the public in Britain than any place else in the world. But it's interesting because they didn't always start that way. What you're looking at now is Hampton Court Palace outside of London, very much modeled on the Versailles method, which is a great house at the center and avenues that radiate out, very formally done, very geometric. This, of course, came from France, and the French got it from the Italians, this idea of formal gardens. And Henry VIII and later kings of England that laid out Hampton Court were emulating Versailles. But what makes, I think, England so special is how the English adapted that. But before we get to that, I want to tell you a little about the formality, because what you're looking at here at Hampton Court is something that is called a goosefoot pattern garden. And as you'll see in this next slide, it is literally modeled on the footprint of a goose. One central core radiating out in three major directions. These gardens, as you can probably guess from looking at Hampton Court, were very expensive to maintain. It took a lot of gardeners. Everything had to be planted over and over again in the season. Lots of geometry required an enormous amount of planning. So two things happened that took them away from Britain. One, changing styles. Things go in and out of fashion, and these went out of fashion, these Baroque style gardens. And two, the money. So it was very easy once later generations came around to plow them under and make them more naturalistic. One of the few that we have left from that time period in Britain is a house in Hertfordshire called St. Paul's Waldenbury that you see there. This is a lovely house that still maintains its gardens in the 1730 Baroque fashion. So you're looking at the house here, and that's the facade that faces out to the garden. In the next slide, you're going to see us with our backs to this front door here, looking out into the axis that goes off into three directions. The one in the middle is the largest, and there are two subsidiary ones there on the sides. You can see them sort of darkly poking in there. Those hedges, which sort of create walls, are about 12 feet high. And each of these leads out into a long axis, and then there are subsections that break away at various points from that. And each of them leads you to a surprise, or in this case, what the Brits call a folly. And a folly is more or less a house with no real purpose or a building with no purpose. It just is sort of there as a bit of fun. And this, the organ house, this is an 18th century house that is at the end of one of these paths. And every one of these is meant to give you a sense of joy when you turn around and see something that you weren't expecting. And as you'll see in the next slide here, the temple, on the left, you can see the journey going up to it from the distance. And on the right, you can see a close-up of it. And you can see it's very small, this temple. It only has space for maybe 2 people to sit, just to contemplate life. Now, what's important about this, the reason I put from Copt Hall, Essex at the bottom of this slide is because in the 1950s and 60s, when so many country houses in Britain were being pulled down and demolished, the owners of this house were buying these follies from various other houses and bringing them back here and incorporating them into their garden. And you can see that in the next slide as well. This is called the Temple by the Lake, and it's the same thing. This was an 18th century folly that was brought from a house called Danson Park. This lake, which is an artificial lake, was created to sort of give you same thing again, this vista. But the garden isn't filled just with vistas of follies. There are many statues, and I came across the next slide literally by accident. I was walking by myself, and this amazing, I think, truly adorable statue of Venus and Adonis, clearly in love, was just under a tree in one of the subsidiary paths, just as you see it there now, shaded, sun. It was magical. I mean, I can look at that now, and I can tell you that my heart beats a little faster because it was a magical moment. Now, when you're in the garden and you're looking back to the house, you're seeing this great vista as well, because that was everything that was central to the idea of Baroque gardening, which is great views. So you can see the house looking particularly grand from this angle. And I should mention that the Versailles gardens, of which this is a descendant, were mainly done by the French designer Le Nôtre, who had this incredible idea of grandiosity, mainly focusing on King Louis XIV, who of course believed he was the center of everything. So this house has an interesting story with people. In the 18th century, it was inherited by this young lady, Mary Eleanor Bowes, very rich woman. This portrait you see painted hangs in the house today. Where that yellow arrow is the house itself. That was considered so important that it was put into the portrait. She, wealthy, a lot of money, the only child, married a Scottish peer. So Mary Eleanor didn't have a title, but she married a title. She married John Lyon, who was the 9th Earl of Strathmore. She became the Countess of Strathmore. They got married in 1767. He died in 1776. Not a hugely happy marriage, not an unhappy marriage, just sort of eh. She is even richer by this point because she inherits all of his estates in Scotland and the title. So she's still young, and she's a hot commodity on the marriage market. And then, of course, we enter an Irishman, by the name of Andrew Robinson Stoney, you see here on the left. So to give you an indication of what he was all about, the expression stone broke comes from his last name. He became her champion. He became her friend. And where you see on the right there, the running footman, this is on the grounds of St. Paul's Waldenbury today. And they would meet there clandestinely. And he was trying to defend her reputation from reports that were being published in the London newspapers about her having an affair with a married man. And he wrote to the editor of the newspaper to defend her honor and did everything he could to make her feel like a better person. So bad did this conflict get between her reputation being sullied that Andrew here challenged the editor of the newspaper to a duel in London, which duly took place. Andrew lost. As he lay dying on the ground, she was there to witness the whole thing. She said to him as he was taking his last breaths, "Is there anything I can do?" And he said, "I would love to die a married man." Just by coincidence, there was a priest walking by who married them. And of course, as it turned out, the whole thing had been staged. There was no smearing in reality. Stoney was writing both ends of the correspondence. The priest was somebody he'd hired. He was, of course, already married to another woman. He had enormous gambling debts, and he needed her money to pay his debts. As I'm sure you all know, in 18th century Britain, actually in the 19th century as well, a woman who had assets, the minute she married, they became the assets of her husband by law. And he stripped everything he could. He sold thousands of acres of her land to pay his gambling debts. These were the lands she inherited from her husband in Scotland. What he couldn't sell were the lands she inherited at St. Paul's Waldenbury from her father, because her father was very smart. In his will, he left these lands to her with the provision that they would only become her husband's if she signed them over to the husband, which she refused to do. He threatened her. She sued for divorce on grounds of cruelty. The suit was thrown out. He put a gun to her head, said, "Sign this now." She refused. And then he kidnapped her from London on Oxford Street, after which a 10-day chase ensued. You have to picture this in carriages. Her friends are chasing her. He's in the carriage with her with a gun to her head. 10 days of going up north till finally they get to County Durham, which is almost to Scotland, where her friends almost overtake her. Some farmers in the fields hear her crying for help, and they save her. Stoney's arrested. He spends most of the rest of his life in debtor's prison. And she, I love this, the Countess decides that she will not marry again. And as you'll see in this next slide, this was big news at the time. This is a headline from 1786 in the newspapers talking about this whole ordeal that Lady Strathmore has just gone through. This remained big news for years, decades, in fact, after this. And in fact, in 1844, which is seminal to this part of the story, a famous author wrote a story, a fictionalized version of her story. And that author was Thackeray, and the name of the book was The Luck of Barry Lyndon. This, if you read Barry Lyndon, or most of us, I think, are probably more familiar with the 1975 movie, which won 4 Oscars and stars Ryan O'Neal. This is the story of her life. Slightly fictionalized, the names are changed, but that's pretty much the real story. And that was actually brought up in 2010, a wonderful book called Wedlock, the true story of the disastrous marriage and remarkable divorce of Mary Eleanor Bowes, Countess of Strathmore. I recommend it very highly. It's a very entertaining read. And she was a remarkable woman. After her second divorce, after her second marriage, I should say, first divorce, she became a huge botanist. She was very involved with the Chelsea Physic Garden. She hired botanists to go all over the world to bring exotic plants back to Britain, and she used her fortune for good. So it's still in her family today, this house. And in this next slide, you're going to see a photograph taken about 1905 of a member of that family. looking particularly cute, who I am positive all of you know what she looked like in her more famous years. And that, of course, is because this little girl was the Queen Mother when she was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, because that was her maiden name. And those two surnames brought together, Bowes-Lyon, were the two families, the Scottish family and the English family. And as I say, the house is still owned by her descendants today. And we were very lucky at NEHGS in September of 2016. We had lunch there and a tour of the garden. And this is our group with our CEO in the middle. And you can see I have yellow arrows to Sir Simon and Lady Bowes-Lyon, who own the house. I love this photograph for lots of reasons, not the least of which it's my experience that wherever I have gone in Britain, the most casually dressed people are always the ones with titles. And you can see, I think that's so evidently here. They were just wonderful hosts, and we had an amazing sun-filled afternoon there. If you ask most garden historians in Britain what the most spectacular garden is in their opinion, because it's obviously always very subjective, you'll find that a lot of them say Stourhead. And you're looking at Stourhead right now. This is the house. No mean feat. It's filled with great art. Unfortunately, the photograph that I took was on a rainy day, so I put on the bottom left there a photograph of that lovely portico on a sunny day, filled with incredible collections. But the reason we're here, of course, is because of the gardens, which most people consider to be one of the finest gardens in Europe, done in the 18th century. The family made their money in banking. Their name, unfortunately, is Hoare, and I will refer to that as the Hoares throughout this little talk we're going to give. And you can see here in this little text that I've put, the gardens were laid out in the 18th century, and everything you see is contrived. So an artificial lake, temples, grottos, obelisks, follies, and everything was meant to be a reaffirmation of Enlightenment thought. So the design was inspired by Virgil, by the paintings of Claude, and by the writings of Voltaire. And this was very much aimed at the visitor, because the idea was that you would only be inviting people to your garden who were as educated as you were. So they would understand the symbolism and understand what you were referring to, not only in design, but in the journey to the underworld. So many of these things come together in a wonderful piece. The Temple of Flora, which you see here, like almost all these follies, has no purpose. It's just there as a pretty little building. This is probably the most famous view of Stourhead, with the bridge in the foreground, the Pantheon in the background. The bottom right, I have a CD cover. This is a British composer named Ian Venables, who visited here in the 1980s, I think for the first time, and was so inspired by the follies at Stourhead that he wrote a series of tunes called the Stourhead Follies, which is just brilliant. It takes you away to a wonderful garden. And speaking of taking you away, I'm going to take you away to a close-up view of the Pantheon, which, not surprisingly, is modeled on the Pantheon in Rome. Once again, no real purpose other than as an eye catcher. You can see, because I know Ginevra's going to move, there we go, the arrow, the size of the humans that are in front of that. So it's not an insubstantial building. But you'll see when we go inside the building that it has no real purpose. It's beautiful inside. It has two benches where you can sit. And if it's raining, it's very nice to sit in here. But it's cold. It's once again, it's meant to enlighten you. That was the whole idea, was that you would be enlightened through a garden. And that symbolism continues into the next folly we're going to see, which is the Temple of Apollo, which you shall see sits on a hill, lovely in its isolation. It's modeled, as so many things were, from the new drawings that were being done from the ancient Roman ruins. In this case, these are the ruins of the Temple of Venus at Baalbek from the 1st century BC in today's Lebanon. And you can see this is almost an exact reproduction. We think that the Temple of Venus also had a dome on it. And this particular building was modeled all over Europe this way. But they weren't just classical things that were installed here. The Hoares had their ear to the ground when it came to things being disposed of in other places. So what you see here is the Bristol High Cross. This was in the city of Bristol. It was created in the 15th century And in the 18th century, it was going to be demolished. And the horror of the time bought it, had it reassembled here. And you can see so many things about the contrived vistas here. So here we have the Bristol High Cross, we've got the bridge, and behind that, of course, the Pantheon. And this is very much what was intended at Stourhead, unlike what you saw at St. Paul's Waldenbury, which is a very formalized avenue. Excuse me. These paths and the lake all appear very random, but they were very much thought out and planned, so that every time you turned, you're supposed to be surprised by a view you saw, and everything was meant to give you the idea that nature had created, but in fact, it was all done by man. And they also tried to include all kinds of civilizations. I'm sure you all know obelisks were invented by the Egyptians, so this is an attempt at Egyptology in the grounds. And what I love about this is that we know from the writings that the sun on the top there was originally gilded. The photograph on the left, you can see the gilding has come off and the copper has been revealed below. The National Trust, which has owned Stourhead since just after the war, after World War II, raised the money to have the whole column, the whole obelisk restored, and had that gilded with 23 karat gold. And I have walked the paths there, and you hit the light just right, and the sun reflecting off of that little finial can almost blind you. Now, that can take us into a completely different bit of history. We have something that Brits make a pilgrimage to come to see and to climb, which is Alfred's Tower, which you see here. Has no purpose except to view the countryside from the very top, almost 8 floors tall. It's just a very long staircase to get up there. And this was built specifically by the Hoare family to commemorate Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great is the only English king ever to have a great appended to his name. And he was also very famously the only English king who didn't lose his kingdom to the Vikings, in this case, the Danes. And I say his kingdom because at this time in the 9th century, England was in confederation of different kingdoms. There was no one English kingdom. And his was the only one that withstood the Danes, and that's why the Hoares erected this, because they believed that this is where he raised his standard against the Danes and fought them successfully off. Now, to me, the most magical part of Stourhead is the grotto. Grottos were a big thing among the rich in 18th century England. And that was the idea that you were walking into a cave, an underground lair of exotic but slightly threatening beauty. And if you didn't have a cave, which they didn't here, you would dig one out, and then you would do what they've done here, which is you take stones and glue them to the wall, create artificial stalactites and stalagmites. And in this case, you pipe water in, you have a sleeping nymph. At the other end of this, there's also a river god, a statue of a river god. And it is magical. It does just what it's supposed to do. It transports you. One of the things we don't have anymore, it was torn down. There was a hermit's cottage that was meant to be like something from a primeval civilization. And the purpose of this garden was to have your friends over, particularly after dinner. And what the Hoares would do is they would hire a local scruffy-looking man to pretend that he lived in this cottage. And when their guests would walk the grounds after dinner, he would pop out and recite lines from Homer. I hope everybody here is familiar with Brideshead Revisited. I think one of the greatest things ever put on film, the 1981 TV series. That's what you're looking at right here, the poster for that, one that made Jeremy Irons a star. It also made another star, and that's the house where it was filmed, and that's Castle Howard in Yorkshire. And it's been estimated since 1981, when this was filmed, that 20 million people have visited this house because of the TV series. And that's astonishing, considering it is very far from London. It's really, I don't want to say in the middle of nowhere, but it's really far out. And when it was built, it was grander than anything the King of England had at the time. It was built the end of the 17th century, 1699, 1700. And I have this quote here from Horace Walpole that really tells you everything you need to know about Castle Howard. Nobody had informed me at one view I should see a palace, a town, a fortified city, temples and high places, woods worthy of being each metropolis of the Druids, the noblest lawn in the world, fenced by half the horizon, and a mausoleum that would tempt one to be buried alive. In short, I have seen gigantic places before, but never a sublime one. As grand as this is, it was meant to be even grander, because you'll see in the next slide, this is a drawing from Vitruvius Britannicus, publication of the Great Houses of England that was done in the 18th century, and it shows you the architect's drawing for what was intended here. And I have to reiterate again how grand this was and how far out of the way this was. This is not close to London, which is what most of the really big houses from the time were. Most of the center block was built. Some of the wings on the side were built and not built, but like a lot of these things, they ran out of money. They still left us with an amazing house. And of course, we're here to talk about the gardens, and to experience the gardens, you have to experience the entry into the grounds. And in this case, you go through the Pyramid Gate, which is one of the gatehouses that leads up to the house. This is believed to be the first building in England to have a pyramid incorporated into it as part of its architecture. You can see what the late respected Hugh Montgomery Maskingbird, an architecture historian, said. The approach to Castle Howard is, quote, probably the most dramatic of all the great houses of England and Wales. And this is just one of the sort of the gateways you go through, leading up to the house and then beyond the house to the gardens. And that's where we're headed. But before we get to the gardens, you have to look at the most famous view of Castle Howard. And that's here from the south facade. This is the one that's photographed the most. This is, I believe, one of the most photographed views of any house in Britain. Doesn't hurt that they have this lovely fountain, a 19th century edition. But once again, like we did at St. Paul's Waldenbury, we're going to put our backs to this house and face outward into the grounds. And this is the idea of the Howards, who built the house and who still own it today, of the three great civilizations of the ancient past: Greece, Rome, and Egypt. And they're symbolized here by statues, and of course, in Egypt's case, a pyramid. Once again, a pyramid with no purpose. It just is there to be Egyptian. It's actually huge. It's much further away than it looks. So starting from here, we're going to go slightly to the left, and we're going to take the walk to the Temple of the Four Winds, which is considered one of the most important buildings in Europe for what it is. And along this walk, which is just a grass path, you see these copies, 18th century lead copies of classical statues that are leading us up to the Temple of the Four Winds. And there's meant to be a great vista here. Once again, very contrived, like we talked about earlier at Stour Head. And that is, you're seeing the Temple of the Four Winds on the left. You're seeing where that red arrow is, the mausoleum, which we'll get to in a minute. And you're seeing the bridge. And this bridge was essential, but not necessarily here. It was put here for reasons of getting a great view. Why is the Temple of the Four Winds one of the most important buildings in Europe? It's important because it's the most accurate reproduction on British soil of the Villa Rotunda. The Villa Rotunda, which you see here on the right in Vicenza in Italy, designed by, I think, the greatest architect who ever lived, Palladio. This is an exact replica in miniature of that. And this is technically a folly. It was not built for a particular purpose. You could have lunch or tea in there. There's actually an underground room where the servants could cook something for you. I was very lucky. A year ago, last June, the curator took me in here. This building is fragile and you're not allowed to go inside of it. It has incredible interiors, but I have to say, what's even more incredible is where we're headed next, which is the mausoleum, which is sadly in danger of collapse and is never open to the public. It is huge, as you can see here. The great part in the middle, the columnar part, is really sort of a church. And then those sort of projections coming out around the base are all spaces for coffins. There are an enormous amount of spaces that are still empty in here. It's a very long walk filled with lots of sheep droppings on the way up here. But when you get inside, it blows your mind. And I have a series that we'll go through quickly of 3 interior shots. I took these with my phone because I forgot to bring my camera. And it shows you the monumentality of this space, but also the religious aspect. You'll see in the next slide, there's a putti, a cherub, that just sweetly sitting there. And the next slide, you're going to see the pulpit, because there are services still held there from family members, and the services held here before the bodies are taken down to the crypt below. But the next slide shows you why, I think. We heard Horace Walpole say it's a place that would beg you to be buried alive. And that's because of the dome, which is just unbelievable. I mean, think of this as your private chapel. It's like, geez Louise. Once again, everything here is meant for the visitor, the educated visitor, to be associated to the great architecture of the past. And in this next slide, you'll see a Claude that's in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston that very much captures what they were trying to do in the 18th century. So this is an imaginary view of Apollo and the Muses on Mount Helicon, but you can very well see where Hawksmoor, who was the English architect who designed the mausoleum, could have been inspired. And this building was popular really from almost the day it was built, and famous. And the next slide, you'll see an 1812 engraving, which was sold. You can see way in the distance, and I should have put an arrow there, you can see the house way over there to the right, the dome of the house showing up. But I bought this engraving on eBay for like 20 bucks. And so not only was it famous in 1812, it's still famous today. And to prove all of that, in this next slide, you have a contemporary artist by the name of Carl Laubin, who is showing you in this Capriccio all the various elements of the follies in the ground. So you have the great house in the middle. Everything around that is something that's found in the grounds of the house, some of which we've talked about, but it just shows you the cacophony of beautiful things. And to show you the enduring popularity of this, I bought this next slide. I didn't buy the slide, I bought the plate last year. This Wedgwood is still making a dinner plate with Castle Howard on it, not just Castle Howard, it has to be said, they have other great houses on it. But this is something that I think shows the enduring appeal of Castle Howard. We can't talk about Castle Howard and not talk about one of the other great houses. I think these are possibly the two greatest houses in England, and that's Chatsworth House. Architecture-wise, I prefer Castle Howard. For overall experience, the winner has to be Chatsworth, because it's an astonishing setting, but because it's still owned by its original family, as indeed is Castle Howard, but in this case, it's owned by a ducal family, by the Cavendish family, who are the Dukes of Devonshire. And this great house you see sitting here was just like we saw at Hampton Court when it was laid out in the 17th century, filled with access with formal gardens. You'll see that this bird's eye view of 1699, the great house in the middle, or sort of in the middle, and all these formal gardens radiating out. Almost all of this is gone today. Once again, just like before, changing styles, expensiveness, although the Devonshires have never been poor, so that wasn't really an issue. It was really one man, and his name, of course, was Capability Brown. And now we enter into why the English garden is unique, why a lot of historians consider the English garden to be Britain's greatest contribution to world culture, because this is a shot I took from the roof of Chatsworth, looking at those same grounds you saw in that earlier slide today. And this would be completely unexceptional to any of us to say, well, yeah, trees and grass, big deal. But this was Capability Brown's brilliance, which is that he did something he called educated nature, which is it wasn't meant to be formal. It was meant to look like God had done it, but he had a helping hand from humans. And of course, it was also nationalistic, because it was a reaction against the French, the eternal enemy of the English, and something that was unique. And in the case of Chatsworth, an enormous amount of what happens here in the gardens is because of water. And you see the weir here in the grounds, which is the beginning of the harnessing of water. There are actually literally acres of artificial lakes created to feed all the various water features. And you'll see in the next slide, the beginning of the most famous of those features. This is actually a viaduct that was built in the 18th century to carry water to a feature. Now, take a look at this slide. Not that exceptional looking, clearly water running along, but at the very end, where Ginevra's putting the little mouse there, that's the end. It drops off to a very big drop. And this is the whole purpose of this viaduct, is to bring water down through this viaduct, drop it down, and this is where it drops from. And it comes into this cascade, which are basically steps with water running down them. But before they get to the steps, they go through what's called the Cascade House, which was built in 1699 by a French architect. And as you can see, almost every little bit of it has water coming out of it. Even the dome has water pouring forth. And when you look from on high, you realize just how high you are. This is, as you can see, a very popular destination for tourists. There are over 600,000 people a year who visit Chatsworth. And you can see how steep it is. That's looking down to the great house at the end there. So the cascade is 650 feet long. It has 24 steps. What's even cooler is that each step is carved out of stone, different kinds of stones, different textures, so that every step makes a different sound when the water falls down from the step above it. And to show you how shallow this was a hot July, and I took this photograph of a little Westie who was trying to cool himself. And you can see how shallow the water is here. And that's the other cool thing in America, where you'd be sued for letting anybody walk in your water. Here in Britain, everyone walks in it, including dogs. You can see the Country Life magazine, the Bible for country house visiting. The readers of that magazine voted this the best water feature in England, which is no small feat, because an enormous amount of houses in England have water in the gardens with all kinds of cool stuff. But in this particular garden, the water doesn't end here at the cascade. After it comes to the end, it goes underground and it comes out into this pool to feed the Emperor Fountain. Now, this was made in honor of an anticipated visit from the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, in the 1840s. Sadly, he never made it. But everything that was created is exactly as it was then. You can see a gardener here turning on the key, as they call it, with that, where I have that red arrow. At every turn makes it higher and higher. You have no concept of how high that is until you see the next slide. It is the tallest gravity-fed fountain in the world. It shoots up almost 300 feet. Since it was installed and until this current day, there is underneath this a house with a turbine. The power of this fountain generates electricity that at one time was completely responsible for every bit of electricity in the house, and now today generates a part of the electricity. But the water features don't end there. There is the copper willow tree, which is very, very sneakily placed on a path in the woods. You think nothing about it. This is a tree made entirely of copper, and there is a metal pedal that's disguised in the path. And when you step on the pedal, the tree comes alive with water and soaks you. And we have Queen Victoria, when she was a princess, talking about the delight of coming on a hot summer day and not expecting this thing. And it still works today. And I think they actually give you a heads up that you're going to get wet. But in the day, it was something that was a complete surprise. And except for that little rim, which you can see toward the bottom, there's no clue that this is not a real tree. As you would expect, a working estate like Chatsworth, and that's one of the things I think that makes Chatsworth so wonderful, it is still very much a vibrant estate with 35,000 acres, lots of farming. They grow their own flowers, they grow their own vegetables, and they raise their own beef. This is a little snapshot of all the good things. This is the Broad Walk, which is what you see in the middle there. To the left is the Temple of Flora. Up from that is the Conservative Wall, which are a series of greenhouses where flowers are grown today. And then beyond that is the Great Stable Block, which is today filled, as you would expect, with a restaurant and a gift shop. The sad thing is what we've lost in the sense of greenhouses is what was called the Great Conservatory, which was the largest greenhouse ever built when it was erected in the 19th century, 277 feet long, 123 feet wide, and 61 feet high. And you can see where that entrance is. That wasn't just an entrance for people. That was specifically built so you could take your carriage in and you could drive down the middle of that. Now, there are all kinds of important things that have happened here, but the saddest one is what happened after World War I. World War I was the beginning of the end of the country houses of Britain. This required, I think, over 30 gardeners to maintain and 300 tons of coal per year to burn to keep it warm. The coal, of course, was diverted for the war effort. The men never came back from the gardening, and after the war, the ninth Duke decided that it couldn't be maintained. Everything had died inside, there was no heat, and they decided to pull it down. It discovered it was so well built that it wasn't able to be easily pulled down, so they had to use dynamite to blow it up. But there are two legacies this has for us. It was designed by Joseph Paxton, who was the chief gardener at Chatsworth. In the 19th century, the Cavendish banana, which is the standard banana of the world today, was developed here in this greenhouse, named after the Cavendish family, who of course are the Dukes of Devonshire. And because of the fame of this great conservatory, Paxton, the designer of it, was engaged to build by Prince Albert what was called, the vernacular was the Crystal Palace, which was in 1851 the first World's Fair in London. And this technology that created the Crystal Palace was only possible because of what he had earlier done at Chatsworth House. This was a big new thing, using iron and glass and steel to create something that was considered a wonder of the world. There is still the site today of the Great Conservatory at Chatsworth. This photograph, you can see the outline on the right. It was huge. It goes way beyond what is visible in the photograph. In the upper left, I have a photograph to show you that there's actually a maze in the middle of this. 1,209 yew trees make up this maze. And it's interesting because the gardeners still talk about this, that when they change the plants, which they dig in this course every year, they always come across shards of glass from when the Great Conservatory was exploded, and I want to point out that was in the 1920s, which is pretty amazing. So I mentioned that Chatsworth is a working estate, and that means, of course, that there's an awful lot of things that are going on that are less glamorous. This is the kitchen garden, the entrance to it that you see here. Even though there are a lot of plants that look pretty there, almost everything is edible in one way or another, and then you can see the greenhouses beyond where vegetables are raised for the house. And of course, this is the nature of a great country house, or certainly it was, which is that because there were no such things as supermarkets or even markets, you had to raise everything yourself. And what you're seeing now is a return to that, and Chatsworth certainly exemplifies that. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire today and the current Duke's father and mother were very big about commissioning new art to go into the grounds of the house. And you'll see in this next slide, one of the most famous of those called the Revelation Fountain, done by Angela Connor in 1999. So this looks like it's a pomegranate. It's not identifiable as a particular anything. It could be a flower. But as you'll see in the next slide, it's magical because it opens. And it has three basic sections. And in the last slide, you'll see it fully open. You can get a sense of just how big it is by the people who are standing behind it. What's amazing about this, in addition to the fact that it moves, is that it's powered entirely by water and by the force of gravity. There's no electricity involved. You can see at the very top of the gold orb, a little bit of water bubbling out. There are about 20 people who make this work today at Chatsworth. Probably 22 full-time gardeners, and you can see most of them here. This is astonishing, considering at one time there used to be over 100 gardeners here. The reason that you can keep things looking so good with only, quote, only 20 is, of course, because of technology. And it's a testament to these people, some of which, the younger ones in particular, have been here for generations. I saw one of the young men, very handsome young man, being interviewed probably about 5 years ago on a television program in Britain, and the interviewer from London was quite clearly confused as to why a young man would want to be here in the middle of nowhere. And he said, because I love gardening and because my father was a gardener at Chatsworth and my grandfather. I think that sort of speaks to the appeal of the British Garden. This is one of the more obscure gardens, not from the cognoscenti, but to most of us, and it's possibly my favorite in this series. It's called Iford Manor. It's in the River Frome, which you see right here. That's the house on the right. I have a red arrow to a statue that's on the bridge. The bridge is owned by the family who owns the house over the river, and that, of course, is a statue of Britannia. And this is important because Britain, by the 18th century, saw itself as the new Rome. And Britannia, as a sort of a warrior goddess, is based on Roma, who, of course, was the symbol of ancient Rome. So you see this beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries going up all over Britain, and even here in a sort of a little quiet corner of Wiltshire. The house itself, which you'll see in the next slide, is nice. It's not spectacular. It has a Georgian facade. It's got Tudor antecedents in it. But the real reason we're here is because of the man you see in the upper right, Harold Peto, who bought this house at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. And he bought it sort of among jeers from the locals, because you can't see it very well here, but behind the house, which is where the garden is, it's a hugely steep slope, which means, of course, it's very hard to garden on a steep slope. And people before Harold Peto had tried, and they had not been successful. And he was considered someone who's coming in from out of town, and they're laughing behind his back, like, like he's going to make a go of that. Well, he made a spectacular go of it. And as you'll see, he loved everything Italian. So he built this loggia as the entrance to the garden. And he believed that you had to have just as many things that were sculptural in the garden as you did plants. And where that red arrow is, that is a Renaissance carving, a bas-relief of an ancient Roman emperor that he set into the wall. He went all over Italy and France and bought things in huge numbers and sent them back to Wiltshire to incorporate into his garden. Because, as I say, as you read here, he believed that it was important to have just as many things in the garden as flowers. Now, as an architectural historian, of course, I find that very reassuring. But a lot of the things he brought back were ancient. Oftentimes they were medieval. And this next bit, you'll see this fountain in the lower terrace, which to me is quintessentially English. This is very medieval. And I'm hesitating here because I took this photograph last year. We took a tour there. And I'm sighing because I remember right near this fountain, after the tour ended, the owners had champagne for us on the terrace, and it was just beyond heaven. So you enter the garden right near this fountain, and you go up these steps that Harold Peto created. He didn't create the steps, but what he created is the ambiance around it, these plinths, these great urns on top of it. And as you walk up these steps and you look to the right, you see this deer statue. I have been here, I think, 4 times, and the first time I came, and possibly even the second, I saw this and I thought it was an Art Deco statue. Only in the last probably 5 years did I realize that it's actually a copy of a statue that was discovered in Pompeii, the original of which is in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, which I was very lucky to see a couple of years ago. This, to me, is a timeless element. I mean, it transcends style. And its position, as you can see here, so it just sort of leaps out. It's very high up, and it's almost frightening in a way, but it's just magical. And as is the next thing we're going to see, which is the Japanese garden, which was meant to be contemplative. And this is important because Japanese art or Asian art was not a big thing in the early 20th century in Britain as it later became. So this was very avant-garde for Harold Peto to put in a garden that was very reverential toward another non-Western culture. The greatest accomplishment, I think, that he did was the creation of the Great Terrace. And this was his successful mediation of this huge slope. So what you see here is a photograph looking up to the beginning of the terrace. Those columns begin this terrace. So what he did was create, and you'll see this in the next slide, a great pathway. He flattened out part of the steepness of the slope and put in this great path that leads the entire width of the garden. And you can see a little folly at the far end there. He put these wonderful columns in part of a loggia. All these are bits and pieces of things that he's bought all over Europe. You can see in the next slide a close-up of the same scene, which to me is quintessentially English, even though it incorporates a lot of Italian elements. It's the layout of the gardens, the idea, and this was very much a part of what was swept in by Capability Brown, that you didn't have formal plantings. You purposely planted flowers in cracks in the pavement. You wanted them to come up in all kinds of wacky new areas. And in a further close-up from the Great Terrace, you'll see this column with a rambling rose growing around it. And that, to me, is this quintessentially English. I mean, there is nothing more English than this view. Then, if you contrast that with the great statue that is in the middle of the terrace, the statue is called the Capitoline Wolf. And it is a medieval statue, mainly from the 14th century, that shows Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, suckling from the she-wolf. And this was something that Pito went to the Capitoline Museum and said, can I make a cast of that so I can make my own copy in bronze? And they were very wary to do that because, of course, every time you take a statue, particularly a big one, and you allow a cast to be made of it, you're taking away some of the integrity of the original statue. I think probably against their better wishes, they allowed him to do it. And that was the last time anyone was allowed to take a cast of this in Rome. And you have this here very clearly telling you that everything in this garden is focused on Italy. And if you needed further reminders of that on our walk on the way to the cloisters, which is the most famous building in the grounds, you can see an ancient Roman sarcophagus. I think this is probably 1st century BC. This is one of a number of sarcophagi that sort of find the way through the grounds. And this is all, as I said, all leading up to the cloisters, which you see here. This is a building that was created entirely from scratch by Pito, using bits and pieces that he'd brought back. I'm sorry from the delay here. I know we haven't gotten there yet. I'm talking about it, but you can't see it. There it is, woohoo! So the bits and pieces, I'm just gonna highlight a few of them. The capitals in these windows, which you see in the far left there, are from Pisa. They're 13th century. On the right, the doorway came from a 15th century house in Mantua. All the elements you see there came from somewhere else. There are even pieces from Chartres Cathedral inside here. The stone itself from the cloisters is actually local. He had craftsmen locally who were always building and taking his various elements and incorporating them into his vision. The first tour I ever took here almost 10 years ago, the owner, the then owner, it's now his son who owns it, took us around and gave us a tour of the interior of the cloisters, where, believe it or not, they have small operas. The acoustics are very good, and you can see the religious element here, the cloister aspect, which of course are all those colonnades going around. And as you'll see in the next slide, I think a prettier view of the cloisters. This is, of course, is what in Pito's mind and in reality would have been something that monks would have been in contemplative use. If you look at the ambulatory, which are the spaces behind the columns, there are little niches and sometimes little altars there. Now, I want to mention that Pito was not religious, but he loved the idea of the old religion. So in this next slide, you'll see this window that he created. Instead of having glass, it has a piece of alabaster from Derbyshire, which gives it a lovely sort of warmy yellow glow. And the crucifix you see there is 16th century from Naples. And then you go right beside this out to this lovely little porch, which has two lions. You're seeing one of them here on the right. These are both 14th century from a palazzo in Venice. And right beneath that, you can see this lovely cat who followed us for our entire tour around the garden. Typical cat. He never got too close, didn't let anybody pet him that I know of. But he definitely wanted us to know he was there. And this is him in all his glory. He did stay for this still photograph when I asked him to. He was actually very sweet. He clearly liked showing us what was most assuredly his garden. I mentioned about water and the importance of water in all of these gardens, a little less so at Eyford, but this shows you little elements, little fountains like this that are just tucked away. And the picture I'm going to leave you with at Eyford is one that could be anywhere, but to me, it just is transformational because it's just an explosion of beauty. And God knows we need beauty right now in our lives. So now I'm taking you to the north, the very north of England. Those of you who are with me for the Great Houses of England lecture will recognize this picture of Alnwick Castle, almost on the border with Scotland and Northumberland, still owned today by the Duke of Northumberland, the Percy family, second largest castle in England after Windsor. So supposedly in the early 20th century, this was, and take a good look at that imposing, scary thing, and then look at this. So these are drawings that came out of a Hollywood studio. They were for an imaginary castle in a movie that was supposedly based on Alnwick, and I'm sure everybody can guess what that movie was. It was the 1939 classic from MGM, The Wizard of Oz. And I love the idea that Alnwick could have inspired that. And it doesn't stop inspiring today because it is a very popular filming location for all kinds of movies. A number of the Harry Potter movies were filmed there. And as you'll see in this next slide, this is from the very first Harry Potter movie where the students are being taught how to fly. And that was filmed on the grounds of Alnwick. You can very easily see when you look at that big view of Alnwick and you think of Hogwarts, that could easily be what this place is. Like a lot of these houses, like almost all of them, in fact, there are follies in the grounds. And we're looking at here, Brisley Tower, which is 6 stories, was built really for only one purpose, and that was to light a fire at that brazier at the top there, a big open flame. When the Duke of Northumberland, when he had a son, an heir, this was to announce to the countryside, and he owned all the land anybody could see for as far as you could see, that there was an heir. That was its only purpose until recently. The current Duke has decided it can be an income-producing property. There are, I'm laughing because there are 6 floors, there's 1 room in each floor, and it's an apartment now. And you have to be young, as far as I'm concerned, to take all those stairs, but it's still a wicked cool building. So I mentioned the current Duke. The current Duke inherited in the 1990s unexpectedly from his elder brother, who died quite young without any children. And the current Duke was his brother's manager of the Alnwick estate. And when he and his wife became the Duke and Duchess, he said to his wife, we have to move into the castle, that castle I showed you earlier. And she said, nope, not doing it. And this is all by Northumbrian lore, so I can't vouch for its absolute authenticity, but it's a great story. And I think at least some of it is true. She kept on saying, I'm not moving into that cold, unfriendly castle. And she kept saying, no. He kept finally saying, well, what do you want to do? How can I change your mind? And she said, I want to do the garden over. And he supposedly in exasperation said, fine, you can do the garden over. Well, this is the garden that she was talking about. This is what it looked like in 1996. This, in this next slide, is the same view today. And she has spent, the Duchess, I think she's been miraculous, she's spent over $30 million creating this magical destination. And it started with this, but it's been expanded into all kinds of things. You look above us there, above the fountain, you can see those arches. That's the beginning of the walled garden, which was her next project. And it's important to say, of course, that every country house had a walled garden, because once again, before the age of markets, you had to grow your own vegetables and you needed a wall to keep out predators. Almost all of them were plowed under when we had the beginning in the 20th century of stores. And this is what you saw in 1996. And in the next slide, you'll see the very same view today after the Duchess came and waved her magic wand. What she has done is created a major tourist attraction. Alnwick is a small little village in the middle of really nowhere, and people come from all over Europe, huge tour buses to see what she's done. Now, if you look here at the walled garden, it's lovely, but it's not just pretty flowers. She has purposes, and she has sort of subsidiary gardens that take different views and different points. So in this next slide, you'll see a lovely liming together of these trees. Everything is just magical, and it all involves water, because right beside where you see here in the next slide, you can see this little canal of water, and these are going all through the walled garden. And one of them leads to another, which leads to another, and they fall down eventually into what's called the terrace garden, which you'll see here in the next slide, which is a little pool. And then that little pool, as you'll see, leads down to another little pool right below it there. And eventually all of these things come out back into the Grand Cascade, which we saw a few seconds ago. Now, this is not just a big water fountain, although it most assuredly is. There are literally rooms beneath this that control all the water. It's done by computers. There are over 100 programs, different configurations of the water. And those first 3 levels that you see there that have very low-looking waterfalls coming down, were built to be a stage, so that in the summer they have plays here, and the water behind can be lit and have all kinds of different patterns that can be the backdrop for the plays that are being performed. So this becomes not just a place to come to see a garden, but a place to come as a cultural venue. And to not have everything appear too contrived, I think, to me, this next slide is one of the most beautiful, because I love wildflowers, and this, of course, has nothing to do with wildflowers. It's meant to look wild. The meadow, which is something that when I see, I just want to roll down the hill. Oh, that's what gardens can do for you. The most popular thing, however, at the Annex Garden is the poison garden. You see the entrance to it here. You have to make an appointment to go in. You see where I have that big red arrow up there. That's because those 2 torches, you can go at night, and those have huge open flames coming out of them at night. Everything in the poison garden is poisonous, and some of them are very poisonous, to the point that if you touch them, you could possibly die. So you are taken through one by one, a tour, maybe 10 people. You get your ticket here at the entrance hut. You have to keep your hands to your side. It's very cool, as you can imagine, especially for kids, because the idea of death by flowers is like, wow. When I saw this hut, I was reminded of a famous hut that is probably more famous to people who are younger than me, but because I love fiction and I love Britain and I love magic, it made me think of this hut. And the man who lived in this hut was a fictional character who you'll see in the next slide, who came from Harry Potter, and his name was Hagrid. And that, to me, is one of the geniuses of what the Duchess of Northumberland has done here, which is that it's not just a pretty garden, it's a garden that has something for everybody. For adults, for kids, because let's face facts, most kids are really like, yawn city when you mention let's go to a garden. But as you'll see in the next slide, one of the most recent things she's put in is the tree house. I spent a lot of my time growing up in Central Florida, and like almost every kid in Central Florida, I worked at Walt Disney World. And that's what this reminds me of. What she has done in total reminds me of Disney. It's very encompassing. It's very smartly put together. It's brilliantly marketed, and it's an astonishing achievement. And sort of the icing on the cake, the acknowledgement that you have an astonishing achievement, is when you have the Queen come to visit your garden. And that's what you see here in 2011. This is the Duchess on the left with the Queen. And of course, the Queen, being British, loves gardens herself. Now, the husband here who paid for all of this, the Duke, probably a little less happy about the garden. And you can see this sweater he's wearing here. Please don't ask me about the bloody garden. It's important to remember that the word bloody in Britain is considered a cuss word. So this is a pretty big thing. But I suspect in his more calm moments, the Duke is very grateful for the huge injection of cash that the tourism that the garden creates has brought to this part of the world. So even though this is a lecture about English gardens, I want to end with 2 slides, one from a garden in Scotland and one from a garden in Wales. So the Scottish garden is this Drummond Castle in Perthshire. This was done in the 17th century by the 2nd Earl of Perth. This is clearly French. And the reason it's French, and this is really in the middle of nowhere, is because for most of its existence, Scotland was threatened by England. So if you're threatened by a bigger neighbor to the south, what do? You ally yourself with that neighbor's greatest enemy, which of course, in this case, is France. So there has been a huge alliance for hundreds of years between France and Scotland, and I believe that's the reason why you see this great formal parterre laid out here in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. It's the influence of the French. More spectacular for me, for my taste, is a garden in Wales owned by the National Trust today called Bodent. It's considered one of the most important gardens in the world. It was laid out in the late 19th century, so quite recent. And what you see here is the laburnum arch, which is 165 feet long. This blooms in late May and early June. I was very lucky to come here in early June, probably 15 years ago, with a Welsh friend. And I pretended to be the obnoxious American tourist and ask all the other tourists to get out of the way so I could take this picture without any people in it. And the most amazing thing about this picture to me is the fact that it's raining. It's a gray day, but it looks like brilliant sunshine because of these blossoms. I mean, this to me, right here, this moment, this is Britain at its best, at its garden best, at its just most magical. And in the last slide, I show you what I think is the quintessential British view, which is wisteria, right up there with laburnum. And this is Dame Miriam Rothschild at her house in Northamptonshire. She's sadly no longer with us. But what you see there, which looks to be like a lot of weeds and things, that's all planned. It's all meant to be what it is. And it's all so very English. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end.
All right. Well, thank you, Curt, for your fantastic presentation. Before we get to your questions, I'm happy to announce that due to the popularity of this webinar series, we will be continuing these programs through the summer and into the fall. So you can now register for the next 3 presentations in this free webinar series. And you can also view other upcoming online programs at americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. I'll be including that link in my email follow-up after today's live broadcast. All right, so let's get to your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask Curt, go ahead and type it into the questions panel. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the time provided. So Curt, one question from Susan. She asks if all of the gardens that we discussed today, are all of those open to the public?
Yes. All the gardens you saw today are open to the public. I generally try not to show you in any of my lectures something you can't see on your own. So yes, and they're encouraged. That's the thing about gardens that are so wonderful, and I think that's what people who own historic houses and have a garden attached to them have discovered, which is that I don't care how wonderful the house is and how many things it has inside of it that are fantastic. You can only go so many times and you're done. But a garden is always changing, not just with the seasons, but as you saw at the Annick Garden, always adding a new attraction. So gardens are perpetually interesting, and the Brits are obsessed with gardens. One of the most amazing statistics for me is the notation that of these gardens, 80% of the people who visit them live within a 50-mile radius of the garden. So these are mainly Brits going back again and again, not foreigners.
All right. And Margaret asks, can anything be done to save the mausoleum at Castle Howard to help prevent its collapse?
Well, that's an interesting question. The curator was very kind to take me down into the crypt. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of empty spaces, and they're thinking of new ways to try to raise money to save it. They did receive, probably over 20 years ago now, £1 million, so almost $2 million from the government to keep the dome from collapsing, but it still requires an enormous amount of work. All the stone has to be saved. And I know that they're applying for grants from the government. The problem is, and this is the problem with people who were once very rich and built like they were going to be rich forever, is that the mausoleum, important though it is one over 100 follies on the grounds of Castle Howard, and all of them are in need of repair. And when you take that one property and multiply it by 1,000, you can see the pool that the government has on its request. Now, this, I believe, is going to go to the top of the pile because it is of European importance. But still, that's the problem that the Howards have at Castle Howard, is that, you know, where do we spend money first? We have this enormous house, we have tens of thousands of acres of grounds, and we have all these things dotting the grounds. And what you probably don't know is that if these buildings are listed, which the mausoleum certainly is, so a listed building is done by the government, and there are 3 listings, 1, 2-star, and 2, and 1 obviously is the most important, and then they go down in importance. If you have listed buildings and you're not fixing them up, the government will come and fix them up for you and give you the bill, because they are considered of national importance and they have to be maintained for the nation. So there are a lot of balls in the air to juggle when you own a big estate like this. But I do think it will be saved. That's my short answer.
And Kate asks, what is the best time of year to visit these gardens?
Well, you would say summer, and certainly I think spring is the most beautiful for the flowers, but for weather, September is the most temperate month in Britain, which means the least rain. And you don't have as many things in bloom in September, early October, but those are the months that I generally try to do tours. The other thing about going in the summer and the spring is that there are a lot of tourists. And believe it or not, it can get pretty hot. So I like the fall because it's a little cooler, fewer people running around. Spring is undeniably the most beautiful because of the flowers that are coming out. But most of these houses have herbaceous borders, which are designed, of course, to have something in bloom 12 months of the year. So you're never going to see a garden without something in bloom.
Now, Nancy asks, which Howard was it that built Castle Howard?
It was the Earls of Carlisle, the 3rd Earl of Carlisle to be precise. And it's interesting how it got built. The Earl had hired an architect and he was unhappy with what he was doing. And he was a member of a club in London that doesn't exist anymore called the Kit Kat Club. And one of his fellow club members was a playwright called John Vanbrugh. And Vanbrugh, who never designed anything in his life, basically the equivalent of said, here, let me take this napkin and draw what I have in mind for your new house. And he designed this without any architectural experience. He designed Castle Howard. He had what they call executive architects, which are actual architects who do the engineering and the logistics, but the concept was Vanbrugh's. And it's an astonishing creation. What's interesting about why there's no title anymore for Castle Howard, because there is still an Earl of Carlisle today, is that I'm sure many of you have heard me say that these estates are entailed, which means an act of parliament says that the eldest son and only the eldest son can inherit, or the eldest male in the family, and inherits everything. Entails are usually done for 3 generations. So when the 3rd generation is dying, the entail expires. And this happened in the 1920s. I think it was the 20s or the 30s. And the then Earl and Countess of Carlisle, who owned Castle Howard, were socialists. And they believed that it was wrong for one child to inherit everything. So because the entail had expired, they said to the eldest son, you're going to get the title in another house, and then we're going to divide Castle Howard among the rest of you. And that's how the title got divorced from the house, because it's inconceivable in Britain to have a house this grand and not have a title to go with it.
Now, just one final question. I know that we're just about at time for today's session. A number of people are asking about tours. So when is our next tour to these beautiful gardens? How can they find out more about the programs that we offer and the tours that we do to England and the UK?
Well, we love hearing questions like that. First of all, you'll see on the slide that says questions, beneath that is an email address, heritagetours@nehgs.org. You can email there and we can send you information, give you information. Right now, as you can imagine, tours are a question mark because of the COVID crisis. We have one tour planned for this year. It's our first Christmas tour. I say Christmas, it's actually the first week in December. And it will be at a house in Shropshire called Weston Park, and it's called An English Country Christmas. And that is we're going to be visiting historic houses, but we're also going to be doing Christmassy things too. We're going to have carolers coming. We're going to have sleigh rides in the park if there's snow. We're going to go to Scrooge's grave. Amazing enough, there is a grave to Ebenezer Scrooge. There are all kinds of fun things like that. But then for the next year, for 2021, we'll be going to Norfolk, the country houses of Norfolk, which will be in, I'm embarrassed to say I don't have the dates in front of me here. So the real traditional, in the nice weather country house tour will be in 2021 when we go to Norfolk, when hopefully we can all travel again. But please, by all means, email us. You can go to our website, Heritage Tours at American Ancestors, and we have all the future tours coming up there. You can also join our mailing list and be notified by email when we have new tours coming out, because we work about 2 years ahead for every tour we plan. So right now, what we're doing is pushing back tours that were scheduled for 2020 to 2021. So like everyone's saying these days, please bear with us. And thank you so much for your interest.
Well, thank you again, Curt. And if we didn't get to your question today, certainly reach out to us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. I will be including that email address as well as the URLs that Curt just mentioned to learn more about our heritage tours and our programming for the next year. And we also want to thank you for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And I also want to note that this free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for other audiences around the world. If you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and the fabulous heritage tours, many of which are led by Curt, please visit us at americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.